I do. I always have questions. So it's a good segue while we're seeing if we can get a chair as to what exactly networks goods are, what are public goods, what is life anyway. And I think the best way to explain at least the possibility of network goods is just to sort of introduce what everybody here does, because we're all in some part or parcel part of the Filecoin network. And the Filecoin network, as well as creating the public good that underlies all what we do, which is the open source software that is a complete stack from libp2p to IPFS, if you've heard of, to the decentralized global resilient storage system that we've built. We also try and provide for and execute on a lot of public goods that are necessary both for our goals to succeed, but also for hopefully the rest of the world. So what I'll do is kind of hand over to each person, and they can describe, I guess, what you do, who you're with, and what you are sort of contributing to the wider network. And you're entirely allowed to imagine what that is in any way you want. So up to you, Shruti.
Thank you, Danny. Hello, folks. I'm Shruti Appiah. I am Chief Economist for Huddle 01. And with Huddle 01, the way that I approach designing the economic protocol is I really view our base commodity, which is essentially DRTC data. DRTC data stands for real-time synchronous data. So any data that gets transmitted when you're actually communicating in a real-time fashion with your peers. So for example, if you're communicating via Zoom, that's real-time data. The way that we measure it is essentially just a combination of bandwidth and the quantity of data. So the lower the latency there is, the better your bandwidth, and the more real-time the data is. This particular commodity is, I view it as a public good. And the way that we have designed our economic protocol is with this view. And we also design it in such a way that this kind of public good mechanism can be sustainable in the long term as well. And the sustainability is really brought about by adaptability of the protocol. And the way that we do adaptability is through hyperorganic minting and burning of the tokens itself. And when we do this, we're able to introduce quite a few interesting effects in terms of the way that the token grows in value, and as well as how we can actually capture value that is being generated by real-world demand of the commodity itself. So I know this was a little bit of a long spiel in terms of like how our protocol is designed, just purely from an economic coordination protocol perspective. But essentially, just want to lay the groundwork for our perspective and how we're actually designing this type of, in the simplest terms, it's literally just a marketplace. But with this view, we're able to introduce a few interesting mechanisms.
So just to put a sort of finer point on that, for those of you who haven't used Huddle, on the face of it, it looks like a really well-executed sort of Zoom video chat thing. We use it in a lot of context for that. But also, because it's a decentralized system with its own internal economy, you're essentially using that untapped bandwidth of everyone's devices in a way that kind of the dream was supposed to be. You weren't supposed to be piping everything through Zoom servers. You were supposed to be using WebRTC and things like this to communicate one to another, so we're sharing this global pool of bandwidth that we've already paid for, rather than to a central provider that we all rely on. And you're chief economist at Huddle, right?
Yes, Danny, you explained that so beautifully.
Well, one of the reasons I've left this to everybody else is that each of these ideas, and we're all part of this wider Filecoin network, is incredibly complicated, and I'm never entirely sure that I've got it myself. So I'm just going to repeat back to people what I think I've heard. So Sarah, if you can describe what your independent organization does in this network.
Cool, thanks. Thanks, Danny. Incredibly complicated is a good view, good point of view. My team is created to kind of solve that. So my name's Sarah. I lead a team called FIL Builders. In short, it's called FIL-B. Previously, we used to do developer experience for Filecoin. as a whole big organization, and now we've branched out to be our own developer experience service. We consider ourselves a public good. There are three main buckets that we cover: education, tooling, as well as community. So in the education bucket, as Danny has mentioned, there's a lot of explanation for Filecoin to do, especially on a technical level. My team tries to, well, we try not to oversimplify, but we try to put it in an ELI5 way so people can understand it. We contribute heavily to the docs. We also do a lot of workshops as well as fun social challenges so that people find Filecoin a little bit more fun other than the heavy protocol stuff that is really cool but can be a little dry. And then in the tooling space, we work a lot on making it super easy for earlier builders to intermediate builders to use Filecoin. We've expanded a little bit more into the advanced space, but on the early to intermediate side, it's mostly around SDKs, easy dApp starter kits. We're working on one right now that just got a ton of comments downstairs at FIL-Dev Summit. And now we're working a little bit more on expanding that to cross-chain data bridges, experimenting with deploying onto Linear, allowing different ecosystems to then store data and retrieve from Filecoin. And then lastly, on the community side of things, there's a ton of work that goes into community. As all of you know, we do a lot of like making friends, getting into new dev groups like Crypto Girls, HerDAO, the Phoenix Guild, all these different groups that we try to have partnerships with and support, and then also have them to champion Filecoin in different ways, and also to give feedback into the Filecoin community and find it easy to participate. So TLDR, that's what my team does, and we hope that that's a useful public good for the Filecoin ecosystem, especially as more teams build on Filecoin. We also give them some light advisory and help them with their docs. So that's how we see ourselves as a public good.
Yeah, and again, one of the things here is these are all independent organizations operating. So one of the ways that I mean, not a completely inexhaustible public good here, but like one of the things is that all of these parties benefit from FIL-B because FIL-B is creating this builder's funnel that is linking together all of these different parts. So Clara, what part do you play in this giant spiders network?
My name is Clara Tsao. I co-run the Filecoin Foundation. And how many people in this room know actually what Filecoin is? Have some good understanding. Okay, great. I just wanted to always check the room. So Filecoin is the world's largest decentralized storage network. We have over 3,200 storage providers all around the world running data centers and tons of exabytes of available storage. And our mission is to preserve humanity's most important information because today, as you know, the internet is not democratic. It usually results show up by who pays the most money in advertising. That, in fact, is controlled by major monopolies. And our role in the Filecoin ecosystem is really looking at long-term governance of the network and really making sure we can invest in the right things to make sure the community can thrive. So some analogies I usually say is, if you wanted to build a city and you needed people to come in to run the sewage system, someone has to build the pipes for that economic mechanism to happen, for private companies to come in. And we think about our role. Sorry, I didn't even know you guys could hear me. I think about my role with others at the foundation as making sure that we can deploy resources in the best way possible so that one day we can be as involved as little as possible, because we've created the mechanisms for other companies to come in and build on top of Filecoin. But there's always going to be work to do. You have to lay the plumbing, you have to get the mechanisms to work, and we do that through a number of ways. We actually have a nonprofit arm called Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web, where we work with a lot of amazing groups like MIT, OpenCourseware. We work with a lot of universities like Stanford, University of Maryland, organizations like CERN to store humanity's most important information. So we store huge data sets that normally would cost a lot of money if they were to maintain and keep it in a centralized provider. We also think about important issues like we just had the elections, and a lot of people today are questioning the security of election data, whether that's tampered, where it's stored, whether people are going to go back and edit information. So we have a whole initiative called Democracy's Library, where we are working with different governments to back up their data and make sure that open and public data sets everyone can access. And I also see that as a public good, making sure that information on the web that is supposed to be for the public doesn't just get taken down, whether that's environmental data or other kinds of data, or whether that's a mayor in a city with high police crime, and the next mayor may not want to show that data, right? We want to make sure that's preserved. We also work with similar groups like Internet Archive to also look at other kinds of data sets. So this is something that's really important to us. We also give traditional grants, developer grants, and other building block grants to make sure our ecosystem can be successful. So I'll pause there.
So again, I'm just sort of highlighting how these things, so Huddle sort of works in a somewhat, I think the DNA of Huddle is sort of a startup. FIL-B is sort of a network-supported organization. The Filecoin Foundation, I know this because I also work there, is actually funded through the Genesis block of Filecoin. It got an allotment of the total amount. So these, again, are different funding systems for different parts of this overall commons. Now, we don't usually break the fourth wall quite here, but Beth, I think that like we see funding the commons as part of this family and this community. So maybe you can talk a little bit how those two things connect.
Yeah, definitely. And so the reason that I was interested in bringing you guys together, yeah, Danny is touching on really perfectly, is as everyone has probably heard too much about today at Funding the Commons, then we grew out of the network goods, I guess, Department of Protocol Labs. And so I came at the tail end of us being part of Protocol Labs. So in terms of exactly how it fit into the superstructure, I have had my own interpretation, but that one has been a really interesting guide for me in my role here, which is as program director at Funding the Commons and leading experience design and program curation for all of these type of conferences and events that we've had. And so what I have tried to do is continue what I understood the network goods kind of narrative conceptual framework to be, which is, you know, you guys are building a lot of different open source software, building, you know, services on top of that, doing, you know, kind of financial like interventions on top of that, and kind of having this complex system related to like open source infrastructure rails. So thinking about what does that mean placed in the concept of, you know, not just public goods that are serving an individual like, yeah, an individual function, but also building together into this complex system of the network. So yeah, I was very curious to hear the perspective from each of y'all as somebody who is building some of those infrastructure rails yourself, as a person who is actively involved in building those, and then as like visionaries and funders behind that. So,
in case it isn't obvious, we also kind of walk the walk as well as discuss how to fund these things and create network goods. Funding the Commons came out of Protocol Labs, which I think still has their logo. Protocol Labs was the organization that was sort of gathered together to create or coordinate the production of Filecoin back in the day. And then, because this is what we live and breathe, Protocol Labs essentially nucleated into all of these organizations. So Filecoin Foundation was perhaps one of the first versions of that was always wired in to the original Filecoin paper. We were pretty much independent before and immediately after mainnet launched. FIL-B came out of Protocol Labs as we sort of unwound all of the different parts. Huddle, you're sort of someone who kind of we supported for a long time, and we were extremely excited to have this sort of synergy. And again, Funding the Commons came out of us wanting to, I mean, I'm saying us as though like we were all in a room together plotting this, right? But these all independently came out because we definitely wanted to widen and encourage this conversation to go more widely. So talking about encouraging the conversation to go wider, so I admit that I completely pulled Beth in because Beth was like, I have questions. And I was like, okay, we'll give you a mic. Can't tell whether it'll work or not, but we'll give you a mic. And I also want to ask anybody here who is curious about the the pros and cons, the things that work and the things that don't about living and working and getting money to live in an entirely networked, won't say network state, that's copyright Balaji, but networked, he'll send a country after me, a networked economy as well. So Beth, can I put you on the spot and ask you to ask the first question if you have any? And then the rest of you can think of questions while.
Yeah, so one thing that was really cool exploring with some of you guys in our conference in San Francisco, and one that's really been a guiding principle for David and me as we've been thinking about what we want to focus on in these event series is really focusing on the different elements of open source development and what that means from all these different perspectives of privacy toward sustainable funding for projects over time, and also as an ideological principle underlying a lot of work we do. So I would love to hear for each of you in your different area how open source development impacts your work and what that looks like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that's, if you've ever applied for any grants in our, for funding out of the foundation, one of our requirements is everything be open source. I mean, we want to make sure that when people build software and ship it, everyone can add to it and make it even better. And that's something that we think is just so important as a principle. We also, a lot of people actually ask me about funding the commons because they don't quite understand what it means. And I go, well, actually, it makes a lot of sense if you understand the history of open source software development. But I'm also actually curious, Beth, and others in this room, what open source software means in today's century for someone that is born in today's new generation, because now the internet is built off of so much open source. Some people may not even remember a time when things were closed source, right? So this is something that we also think about as the web evolves with AI and other emerging technology, how to really think about each evolution and how to also bring the right stakeholders and community together to understand that, because a lot of our next generation of public good activists, they also have to understand the history and DNA and growth of the web and how software just became better when we opened it up, and how it's also opened up other ways to think about funding mechanisms in the world.
Yeah, and so that's a good question, I think, from both Beth and Clara. So you guys were asking about open source development and how that is impacted by public goods funding. This is something that I do think about, I think especially in my role. So my team works on a bunch of different tools that many, like maybe teams that become startups later on or are trying to become startups will then use the underlying technologies that we built. So for example, we built some contract templates and all of that, and people do use that within their architecture and then go on to fundraise, which is awesome, right? And we also give them technical guidance along the way. So that in a way is open source development. We also work with, for example, Protocol Labs Dev Guild, which was a recent program that came up. And so we have a bunch of like younger devs or solo hackers that want to come in and contribute to this open source software. And I'm really happy that they're getting paid while they compensated for their time while they help out on the PL Dev Guild. Now, I think in a way like that is kind of a new sense of open source development where we get compensated well enough for the work that we do, and we are producing base technologies that then teams can go take on and then build a startup from. I think one thing that we do need to figure out later on, and I think this is especially where Retro PGF comes in as a very important program, is that once these startups build what they're building, and if they find success, if they find product market fit, they find impact, if they go into retro PGFs, how do we then, through a good measurable way, and I was talking to some of the either counterfactually folks or some of the impact rating folks, how can we then have a rating system that tracks back everyone that has contributed to that project? Because even sometimes when we build base technologies, there is an even deeper base from our protocol R&D team, Phil-Oz, and I'm like, I don't want to go get a grant and then not give them back some of the contributions from what we got a grant for. So how are we able to trace that all the way, right? And again, this applies to even the art industry, right? When you create something new, people are building off that idea. So that is something super interesting in my space that we think about, but I think Protocol Labs is moving in the right direction to make sure that we do fund some of the contributors that come in, and we're trying to catch that as much as possible along the way. Yeah.
I think there are so many interesting perspectives in this room regarding open source. I want to also sort of motivate as to why we need to actually open up digital goods and treat them as public goods as well. Certainly, there has been a progressive, positive trend when it comes to opening up software, but we also see a lot of counter forces as well. A lot of what we have as open source software today has been built on open data. So that's the very bottommost layer. We have open data that has enabled us to actually build out open models, and then on top of that, we've been then able to build open software as well. And software is really at the very top layer where we're actually considering applications of the utilities that we can build from data, from models and infrastructure as well. But what's happening now is we're actually seeing rapid centralization of infrastructure. Similarly to how we saw centralization and closing of models as well, we have been seeing for the past decade actually closing of infrastructure and consolidation of infrastructure in the hands of a few proprietary entities. And that's where I think that we need to really change and make infrastructure be able to be decentralized as well. And that's one of the things that's really interesting about a lot of these physical infrastructure networks, decentralized physical infrastructure networks as well, particularly Filecoin. What we do with Huddle 01 as well, we are decentralizing the infrastructure that has to do with data ingress and egress. And so essentially that's anything. Our competitors aren't Zoom. Our competitors are indeed AWS and the Google Clouds of the world that actually power the infrastructure that supports all of the media on top of it, all of the communications on top of it. Similarly to how a Filecoin might be actually, their equivalents in the centralized world are essentially all of the storage providers as well, right? So I think there's a real need for us to be able to dismantle all of these centralized systems and remove the consolidation of it as well. Like to cite one example, one of the things that we've seen in very recent times is the closing down of a lot of artificial intelligence companies such as OpenAI and the process of them having to go from being open and having a very democratized view of their products. Those business models weren't sustainable because of the fact that all the infrastructure that they were running on became too expensive for them to be able to support in this free fashion. And as a result, they've had to go closed. Similarly, we've seen a lot of companies in that space go defunct as well, such as Stability and so on, for this very reason. So I think that the system overall, when it comes to software development, has really reached that tipping point where, previously we were able to support a lot of open source models, open software, because we had this wealth of open data and open models. But now I think that we need a counterforce to be able to, again, go back and decentralize and redesign the system in such a way that all of the participants are rewarded in that fashion as well. So
just to sort of add to all of these things, I think one of the reasons why we work so hard to re-decentralize these networks is so many of the support systems, both in society and both in the open source environment, have ended up being diverted into these centralized systems. I talked to a lot of, I guess, a sort of millennial sort of generation of folks who came into the open source environment, and many of them came through the Google Summer of Code. And I saw it as a real warning when some of the creators of the Google Summer of Code program, which was this sort of nurturing program for entry-level sort of open source developers, the founders of that were one of the people that were kind of quietly pushed away from Google as it tries to pivot to a more sort of aggressive profit-making environment. And one of the reasons why, if you have anybody in your community who is interested in making money in open source or creating network goods, we'll point them to the PL Dev Guild, which is a great project and very specifically founded by some people who went through that process, and we want to make sure that that funnel not only still exists when the Googles of the world kind of turn their back, as they have on the commons, but directs people into the right direction. Okay, so we've just got a few more minutes, so I'd love to sort of open up this if anybody has any questions. including where do I get grants to do these cool things? I know what you're secretly thinking. Anybody have any questions? Go on. Beth. Yeah, I thought you might.
So I can ask infinite questions. They might get, increasingly repetitive. But the other thing that I thought was super relevant to hear from each of your perspectives is, as we are thinking about software as a commons, I think that has a lot of different interpretations to everyone. So for me, the first thing that springs to mind is how, all of our collectively generated data, feeds into AI models, which then, impacts all of us, as a commons and kind of that feedback loop. But then, there's also the infrastructural rails, which some of you guys are building, and certain levels of software, like Web 1 that's kind of considered this public good for everyone. And something that's kind of collectively owned and utilized by, or not owned, I guess, utilized and enjoyed by the commons. So I'm curious to hear how concept of commons intersects with software development and tooling for you guys.
Yeah, I think the beautiful part about the web and also a decentralized web is we get stronger the more we decentralize and the more that we can have different communities pop up in our ecosystem. And we've seen that year over year in the Filecoin ecosystem as we have lots of storage partners. This year is especially exciting because we have a lot of startups that are all ready to build for different kinds of storage categories. We spent actually the last 3 days at the FIL-Dev Summit, which is right next door to here, just talking about all the possibilities of, we're sitting downstairs 2 floors, all the possibilities of what we could store on a decentralized web. And I think that's an example of, when we have the building blocks there, now everyone can use the technology to be able to optimize for different kinds of use cases. I personally fell in love with decentralized storage because I spent more than a decade of my career looking at content integrity online. And when you look at online disinformation and all these challenges, whether it's terrorist attacks, a terrorist attack just happened 2015 down the street that was linked to Islamic terrorism. The web is a fueling ground for a lot of rabbit holes of terrible things to gather together that are polarizing society. And we're seeing the offline effects of that as well. I think everyone can feel it, whether that's during the pandemic or in other extreme ways. And the way that we're gonna end up being able to take away the business models that are creating these rabbit holes are to really think about how we can do it better and remove that incentive structure. Every company building on Web 2, they will go bankrupt to their investors if they don't sell advertising. And that same algorithm that gets people to get addicted to content is not only making our world less smart, it's creating these feedback mechanisms that actually encourage really malicious and bad behavior. And so when we can solve content integrity and also look at better ways of doing it where profit doesn't belong in the hands of one centralized company, but in the hands of all the beautiful startups and players in our ecosystem. And beyond that, I think that that is really the commons for me, where people, users at the end of the day, really get to own their own data, and they get to choose what they do with it, and they get to choose where it's stored, and they're not going to be necessarily handcuffed by a Google or a Apple to pay another $10 a month for storage.
And just building on that real quick, I know we're almost at time. I'd like to share a technical idea on this, right? So we prototyped something called a data DAO last year. Basically, it's a bunch of smart contracts that allow users to upload, like crowdsourcing data, right? You can upload your data, but you're incentivized to do so. You're incentivized to upload your data, you're incentivized to upload good data, and you're also incentivized to continue paying so that, or maybe dripping funds in some way, or figuring out a way that your data DAO can create a treasury for the usage of that data so that it can continue the perpetual storage of that data. That was actually a pretty interesting idea. We've been talking to a few teams about possibly putting it into motion. We'd love to talk to anyone that is interested to build something like this, but I think that's something that can help to build data integrity, which is what Clara was talking about. Realistically too, I will say that DWeb and doing this, we are on the trajectory where it's going to be a really painful path to do so. It's not easy. There are like a lot of UX issues to work through, right? So I'm not selling a dream here. I'm selling an idea that we really need to work at. But I think it's a good idea to think about. Yeah.
Well, time is up, but I would like to leave you all with a question, which is that how might we keep decentralized systems decentralized? And, well, I think that, let me give a little bit of context. The state that we find ourselves in right now with traditional systems, like the traditional economic system, is due to preferential attachment. It was decentralized, and it was conceptualized as being a decentralized system at the start. However, it has progressively become more centralized due to consolidation and preferential attachment. So, you might have heard of power laws and scale-free networks. If you're not familiar with scale-free networks, really encourage reading up on network science, particularly by Barassi and Albert. And what these systems do is the nodes that actually have a high quantity of something, they preferentially are able to attract more links to them, and thereby these decentralized systems start to become centralized. And it might seem like a very natural phenomenon that decentralization always with some time, it does lead to centralization. But I'm sure that there are some system designs that we can implement in order to counter this force. And we have smart contracts now, which are machine enforceable. So I think this is the perfect environment for us to implement these types of mechanisms in.
Favorite topic. Well, that's a great moment of optimism and warning to end on. Thank you all very much for sticking with us then. Beth, is there anything on after us? Or is it?
We might have a goodbye from David, but we will have to hear from him tomorrow morning.
Okay, well, in that case, we won't stop you going out and mixing. You can probably gate crash us if you can work out how to get to the Dev Summit. It's 2 floors down. You have to go through a long, complicated route, but you can do it. I just want to thank the AV team for really, thank you.
Let's also have a thank you to Arun, who's been a very delightful MC and came back early from Chiang Mai to help us and has been so sweet, so thank you.
You want to have the last word? Now you have a question. Now everybody's like, finally we can drink. Now you have a question. Okay. Show him the 1 minute. What's your question?
Is the Filecoin Dev Summit still open right now, or are you guys done?
I think there are 2 parties going on simultaneously. So, like I say, you can try and gate crash, but there's really interesting people here. There is a...
Well, our venue's closing in like 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, drinks. They're a public goods. I think that there are parties going on. I also know there's a PLL Network Dev Summit going on in the next weekend.
There's after hours tonight for anyone that's in the Protocol Labs network, which I'm sure you guys can.
I'm now officially blessing you with, you're all part of our network good. And Clara will either tell you where it is or...
If you're feeling guilty about crashing, it's at a venue called Guilty.
Oh, great.
It's in the hotel.
It's at Appiah Hotel just down the street, around a 7-minute walk.
But honestly, the conversations I've had here have been so worthwhile.
I think midnight.
There we go. All right.
These are some of the kind of like, I think, original predecessors of funding the Commons before, before a lot of us existed. So thank you.
That makes it seem old, but I do remember the first ones, the first funding the Commons, and it was really exciting to see a community come together on these ideas. And
It was remote, I remember.
Yeah, it was COVID. Was it? Yeah. And I've just been blown away with the conversations and the organization. So thank you. Thank you all. Okay.